A really interesting trend that we see is that many very high net worth individuals are shifting to homeschooling.
It's crazy how many options are available, which is a good thing, but that's tough for a parent to navigate for a decision that's so important.
So then for us, the mission becomes how do we make sure that's accessible to everybody? And so rather than having a personal assistant who you can delegate that to, is we're creating essentially a digital version of that.
Hey, welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm Charlie Deist. Today, I'm joined by Jonathan Chizick and Robert Gamble. Jonathan, Robert, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Excited to be chatting with you, Charlie.
So smartpath.school, a kind of curriculum navigator for homeschooling families in this sea of different options out there. There's been an explosion in the number of options that families are choosing from when they start to customize their kids' education. I called it a curriculum navigator, but is there certain terminology? How do you explain it to somebody for the first time?
We're still working on that, but I kind of describe it as like an AI advisor to help navigate through homeschooling. So initially it's matching with curriculum. Down the road, it'll match to other services too. You mentioned in the intro about this ever-growing of stuff that homeschool families have access to. And that's absolutely correct. Like, it's not even just the curriculum, but the teaching styles and, micro schools versus co-ops versus, learning at home. These new options that are popping up every year. In addition, there's more people who are, new to homeschooling, right? So if you've been in homeschooling for a while, you might be thinking about, do I switch curriculum? Do I switch what I do with my kids? But if you're new to this and you're thinking, what we're doing today with public school is not working, I want something different. And you get into start looking and researching what options are available. Like, it's crazy how many options are available, which is a good thing, but that's tough for a parent to navigate for a decision that's so important. It's your kid's education. So we want to provide a tool that helps them navigate through that process in an easier, more effective way.
I imagine that back in the day, you'd go to the homeschool convention in your state or in your city if you lived in a big enough area. And I can imagine walking around that expo hall and getting a bit of that feeling of overwhelm. But now it's compounded even further by just this sort of digital marketplace that doesn't actually even exist as a marketplace. So, I mean, what's kind of you mentioned or alluded to sort of the long-term vision that it will expand beyond just curriculums to include these other options that are available. When you're saying that, it just made me think of the way that homeschooling as a term, as a category, has evolved from something that, people narrowly did at home with the workbooks and the curriculum in a box, to now people are realizing you don't actually have to stay in the box. You can kind of color outside the lines a little bit. You can find courses in your community or find other parents. And then those parents might kind of form a co-op or at the more organized scale, they might form a micro school. You mentioned micro schools, and there's 50 different philosophies of micro school. So again, it's like, we come up with, there's all these different labels for philosophies and pedagogies. How do you start to make those decisions if you are new to homeschooling? Like, where do you go to figure out, like, what is your cup of tea?
Well, we want to help with that. I'll use my personal experience. When my wife and I went through this process of moving our kids from public school into a version of homeschooling, we were overwhelmed at first. Some of that was just because our impression of homeschooling was from our time in high school when we knew some homeschoolers, which was a long time ago. And a lot has changed in 20, 30 years. And suddenly seeing all these different options that were available, our process based on the homeschool families we've spoken to when we're developing SmartPath, like, it's a pretty similar experience to what we had, just trying to find as many people as possible who've gone through this and talk to them and get their advice. And so whether that's virtually through Facebook groups or in person through local churches or other organizations or neighbors or friends of friends or family, it's just trying to talk to as many people as possible and hear, what did you do? What did you like? What didn't you like? What is your kid's learning style? And try to figure out, is that similar to my child's learning style? And then a little bit of trial and error of, okay, we're going to try this and see how it goes. And maybe next year we do something different if that doesn't work. And that was part of the impetus for SmartPath, was there's got to be a faster way to get to where we feel we're making a decision that we're comfortable with and not just feeling like, wow, this is a pretty high involvement decision. It shouldn't be, it's not like picking a restaurant on Yelp. right? You pick a wrong restaurant, you just don't go back and it's no big deal. You're out $50 and a night and some bad food. But this is your child's education, so you don't want to screw it up. There's got to be a better way than just trying to talk to as many people as possible and hoping that it makes what made sense for them also makes sense for your children.
Yeah. So you guys both have kind of tech, startup backgrounds. Robert, I think your background is mostly in sort of operations. I'm curious if you can, first of all, explain like at a high level, what business operations are in the context that you're used to coming from, and then how your vision for business operations plays into the vision for SmartPath.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, typically the way that I've seen business operations rolled out at different companies is it tends to be a blend of kind of taking your typical high level standard business KPIs, understanding how those drivers impact your business, but then relating it to also the secret sauce within the space that you're operating. My background has typically been within mobility, logistics, fleet management, inventory, supply chain. All of those businesses, you're going to have the same KPIs like your top line, your cost understanding, your inventory, but then there's always kind of a secret sauce that is within that business, which is, how do we manage our people when they're out doing tasks in the field? How do we understand the health of a fleet? How do we understand how our customers interact with a physical product that we don't have eyes on at all times? I think BizOps really represents the marrying of how do you, take those things that are not typical to every other business out there and understand how that drives your more traditional business KPIs, and then have the right monitoring tools and data infrastructure in place to make sure that you're actually creating leverage off of that for making decisions. That's typically kind of the space that I've always lived in is, how do we basically make sure that we're getting as much input from our business and the various mechanisms for collecting information that we can, and then drive that into actionable business insights, and then, be the PMO for actually going and executing based off of that information.
And for the people that don't speak startup ease, we have KPIs, key performance indicators, and then that second PMO. What is that?
Yeah, like project management office.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. And typically, I think business operations tends to be, especially for startups, you're going to have, I think, two different functions that are sitting in one business or one team that you would typically see broken out at a Fortune 500, which is you're going to have your insights team, which is understanding those levers. And you're going to have the team that says, okay, here's what we're actually going to go do and execute to improve the business based off of those insights. Typically in a startup, you're going to be wearing multiple hats. So you're going to be doing both of those things.
Right. What are the lessons that you're translating over? How are you thinking about, first of all, collecting those insights and then applying them, making them actionable to improve the product or to get it in front of the families who would want to use this tool?
Yeah, I think in the end, whether it's fleet management or whether it's helping people make educational decisions, I think creating a low drag experience, right? There's ways you can always track the positive outcomes within a business, right? Which is somebody came to our website, they engaged with our platform in some way, they bought something, and then they left us a good review, right? Like that's very easy to track. What's hard is understanding maybe why that process breaks down at various points, which is also very similar to understanding why a customer, for example, might open up your app, see that you have a scooter that they want to rent nearby, and then for whatever reason they walk up to it and they don't complete that successful journey. Mm-hmm. It's very similar in terms of kind of breaking down the various steps and the various kind of forks that people might, or paths that people might follow in that user journey. And then understanding, why are we getting the outcomes that we like and why are we not getting the outcomes that we don't like? And then beyond that, I think you have to have the customer as your number one priority at all times. And so constantly reassessing, how are we improving the customer experience with what we're doing? Are we making decisions based off of an understanding of our customer, or are we just kind of guessing? We always want to be in the former category, right?
Yeah. So coming back to this idea of almost like an AI guidance counselor, or like the school counselor who might help a high school student come up with their schedule. Obviously, AI is creating new possibilities for sort of assessing all these options simultaneously, but being able to take a set of inputs, which in the case of the SmartPath tool at the moment is like, you fill out a form with information about the student, whether that's, your child, or maybe if it's a high school student, maybe they're doing this themselves. What's the right level of granularity for the data to collect? One of the things I notice is that you can either fill out a longer version of the form or skip. Maybe if you're just brand new, you don't have too many preconceived notions, but just from that user interface experience, How do you think about the best kind of information to collect? And then without revealing any of your internal secrets, what's going on underneath to generate the outputs?
As far as the the data, there's always this balance between how much you ask, what you're going to do with it, and the benefit the customer is going to have. So you don't want to ask too much and scare people away, but you want to get enough information in that you can provide good results back. And some of it is, our AI model is developing. So down the road, we'll be able to get a lot more specific, maybe add a lot more questions that are relevant that will help provide better results. So we're starting off with kind of a core set of questions that are the same things that parents would be thinking about when they're looking for this new experience. Like, what do I want in this experience? Well, one is just like, okay, who are my children? What age are they? What are their interests? How do they learn? But then also, am I looking for, online experience or in person or hybrid? And, are there cost constraints? Kind of these basic search criteria. So we need to capture that. And then we'll start adding on additional questions as the model gets refined and is able to utilize those answers. We don't want to overwhelm parents by asking me, here's a 20-minute questionnaire when we can provide really good results without that 20-minute questionnaire. But down the road, eventually, it could make sense as we continue to gather more information, as long as it's providing value back to the customer and providing them with very curated, relevant recommendations. Like, they're going to want to do that. And it's going to be a benefit to them.
Right. No, that makes sense. And Jonathan, you said that you and your wife maybe recently or at some point in the past several years made a transition from what you might call the traditional school system to homeschooling. Robert, before the show, we were chatting a little bit and you said you're not a homeschooling parent at this stage. You weren't homeschooled yourself, but something sort of drew you to this opportunity as a technologist, as a business operations person. I'm curious what that was and how your perceptions of homeschoolers as a category have evolved.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, for me personally, I went through the public school system in California, specifically in the Bay Area. And so, I personally did not feel very satisfied with it. And that was almost 20 years ago now that I was wrapping that up. For me, I think growing up, I always saw that there were challenges in the public education system and where it fell short. And so, couple that with, now being an adult who spent some time in the business world and is be a little bit more conscious, I would say now, about how do I spend my time to make sure that I'm doing things that are important with my professional career and with my life. And I think education is really foundational to a happy, successful society. And as I start to look at the performance, both within college admissions, but then also further on in life, the outcomes for home educated kids just actually seem to be really positive when other education formats are actually trending in a more negative direction. And so that was kind of my motivation to get into this space. In terms of my first exposure to homeschoolers, it was actually my wife's cousins. They were both homeschooled. They homeschool their kids now. They're wonderful, well-rounded, intelligent, super successful people. Their kids are super happy. I love hanging out with them. And so for me, it was my first exposure to people who had actually homeschooled, and they're awesome. That kind of took away whatever maybe perceptions I had as somebody growing up in the Bay Area prior to that. I know that's kind of how I ended up here. And, my wife and I are starting a family this year, and we 100% plan to homeschool. I see it as a really amazing opportunity to rethink how we educate kids, right? We're in the middle of this amazing technological transition, which you alluded to earlier, in terms of the rate at which technology is allowing content and platforms and resources to be released. I definitely think that in such a transition, if we were to think about education with a blank canvas, would we do education the way that we have traditionally for the last 200 years? I personally don't think so. And I think that home education represents a flexible platform to do things like digital education, micro schools, one-day academies, pod learning. There's so much flexibility and customization in there to where it can really be fine-tuned for each student individually.
Yeah, I get the sense that there could be a point where there's maybe like a critical mass of families who are doing some kind of a hybrid thing. And then there's kind of this big aha moment that, there's different functions that the public school system fulfills. One of them is educating kids, but another one that's not to be underestimated is just the sort of daycare function. And parents who work
Totally.
maybe would be curious or open to homeschooling. It becomes sort of a non-starter. But you can imagine where if there are all these almost like WeWorks for education, or like micro school malls where you pay an upfront fee that gets you into the building, and then you can take classes from all of these different philosophies. And then there's just sort of space that are supervised where kids can do their digital or other curriculum that their parents are selecting for them. I don't know if you guys have encountered the synthesis tutor and synthesis teams, but out of the SpaceX Ad Astra school, there was a school at a SpaceX campus that spun off and created this math tutor tool that customizes the content based on what the kids' interests are, and it's game based. These are the sort of things that I can see parents getting a little bit of envy from the outside. Robert, when you and I think we're about the same age, when we were going through the public school system, I think there was a little bit of this sense that, homeschoolers are these weird, socially awkward kids. There was one gal I remember who came into my school in 5th grade after being homeschooled. She was smarter than everybody, but she let you know it too. And that was something that she had not been taught, was like how to not be annoying. There is something to be said for this sort of socialization among your peers. It's it's an open question how we're going to sort of solve that as homeschooling goes more mainstream. But yeah, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you guys is like, how do you keep your finger on the pulse of what families are using? Homeschooling is such a word of mouth driven scene right now. What sort of tools are you using to surface what's actually being used by families? What's popular?
A lot of talking to homeschool families and the networks. It's just trying to keep up on the same way you would with any other trends, right? And then actually talking to the people and just getting a sense for what are they using, and trying to get a variety of inputs from different people in different areas of the country, because it does tend to vary by state, but part of this kind of highlights what parents are going through with just this proliferation of options, because there's like for us, like we're in the business and we're in the tech startup world, so we're always subscribed to all the newsletters and watching the X feeds of what's new and what's hot, and there's all these new like educational options coming out and cool new things. If you're just an average parent who's not in the tech startup world and not doing that, like how do you keep up on what all these new options are for your kids? Right. So it's one of the missions of SmartPath is to, okay, well, let's help parents. You don't need to stay on top of it, but surface what's relevant to you at that time when you're like, this is what I'm looking for, what's out there. It's a cool idea. How many parents know that exists where it does exist? There's co-ops that are 2 miles from my house that I didn't even know about for over a year after we started homeschooling. Once we found out about it, I was like, that's a great idea. I wish I had known about this earlier. Let's do that. So the fact that I don't even know things that are 2 miles from my house, that's an issue. How do we help parents know what these options are that are in their neighborhoods and they have access to?
Yeah, it's wild for me as a marketing person within the OpenEd company. I had to figure out what are the channels where I can surface some of these insights. And you find, there's homeschool Reddit, there's a handful of blogs, the sort of homeschool moms, the Pinterest accounts where everything is very bespoke and on point. But when it comes to the actual community, where the actual information exchange is happening, it seems like a ton of it is just in these private Facebook groups. And they have hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of members in a geographical area or around a certain philosophy. But for the most part, they're private because parents want to be able to have a little bit more of a safety around the conversations, I guess. And I've found my way into a few of them, not as an eavesdropper, but as I'm a homeschool dad. I've got a kid who's coming of the age where we are starting to do more homeschooling ourselves. You just find that there's sort of a different language that they're speaking in these groups. And there's a lot of people are asking the exact same questions, especially on Reddit, I've noticed. Every time people, for the most part, step up and offer a few suggestions, but it's not centralized or organized in any real way. I think that
and there's no way to search it too, right? You might have they're asking the same questions. And it's like, Facebook groups is notoriously bad for that. Like, how do you find answers to previous questions? You can't.
Yeah. And, I'll say that I think the organizations within this space that do have some kind of resources and organization to bring to bear on this question, I'd love to do more cross-pollination with you guys and find ways to draw attention to this with our audience. And I wanted to ask one more thing before we wrap up here, which is just kind of what fires you up about this mission? Is there anything in particular that, of all the opportunities and with AI and just the state of, you could create sort of any app, why this one?
Well, for me, and I definitely want to let Robert give his point of view because he's got a great one. For me, it's just, having seen and gone through this with my children, how important parental involvement in education is, and having the ability to help direct your children to what their interests are and how they learn, and have them come out of their high schooling experience in a much better state than where they would have otherwise. And that the flexibility that, these new educational options offer, it's so powerful. And, more parents should, one, be aware of it, but two, be able to access those and not feel like it's homeschooling. I have to quit my job and stay home, or public school. Like, there's so many
Right.
variations in between. Like, let's get them access to that.
Yeah, for sure. And you, Robert?
Yeah, I think a really interesting trend that we see is that many very high net worth individuals are shifting to homeschooling. This has been a trend over the last, say, 5 to 10 years now that's become quite prominent. And so, especially amongst Silicon Valley types, they're doing, their kids are not going to public school. They're not going to private school either, for the most part, right? They're being homeschooled. So if people with resources are choosing to homeschool their kids, then that tells me that it's probably one of the best routes in terms of making sure your kids have the best options possible. They get the best education possible. So then for us, the mission becomes, how do we make sure that's accessible to everybody? And so rather than having a personal assistant who you can delegate that to, is we're creating essentially a digital version of that to bring the same level of bespoke recommendations, the same level of understanding, or as close as possible, at least in this first iteration of our product. But over time, delivering, the same experience so that cost, time, risk aversion, ambiguity doesn't create a barrier for parents to go and find what can really be the best educational option for their kids.
Did you see the clip of, I think it was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, Naval Ravikant talking about how parents who don't homeschool, like, their lives just suck? He put it bluntly, but and I think, we don't want to we don't want to sort of flip what's been the norm, where it's the homeschool parents who are bear the brunt of all this judgment around, and flip that. But, the point was that you got to drag your kids screaming out of bed in the morning and get them to school, all these things that the frictions that exist with the status quo. But, we know there are still a lot of frictions for whatever path you take. So trying to ease those, you guys are doing a great service with this tool, SmartPath. And again, it's smartpath.school for people that want to check it out. It's free. You can, right now, I don't know if you guys have plans to monetize it at the level of the user, or if it's going to be more of like the provider marketplace referral fees. But I'd love to keep tabs on this going forward. Any kind of closing thoughts or things that either of you wants to share?
I think we covered everything. Really appreciate you having us on here, Charlie.
I really appreciate it. I think both you at OpenEd and then this whole space, it's incredibly welcoming. The people in this space are incredibly welcoming, whether it's the parents, the families, the publisher, various program offerings. Everybody just seems to really care about educating kids. It's a really just wonderful, warm space to be in. So thanks for chatting with us.
Likewise. Thank you guys.